Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Just in time for Juneteenth, the Democratic-controlled Senate is floating yet another bit of meaningless message legislation that's meant to get the attention of low-information voters. And just like the aforementioned Juneteenth, this proposed legislation also does absolutely nothing tangible for black people, though it is meant to get us into supporting it because these white liberals hope it's going to make us feel good, and hopefully that temporary sugar rush of good feelings will translate into us actually wanting to vote for Joe Biden in November. This latest empty gesture originates with Senator Cory Booker. He's introduced a bill that would give the site of the Tulsa Race Massacre, that is Greenwood, Oklahoma, national monument status. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing it, but the question is, why this and why now? Nothing happens in a vacuum under white supremacy, and Cory Booker has been a willing bootlick for the white powers that be. And this gesture is particularly cynical coming from the U.S. government. After all, the Tulsa Race Massacre was one of numerous white mob genocides that took place across the country, and the U.S. government did absolutely nothing to punish any of those white mobs back then or in the present. The U.S. government was on the side of those race mobs, and this legislation does nothing more than to say, hey, here's where we committed one of our countless local genocides against black people in America. That's what it actually is. It's a celebration in the eyes of these white supremacists. Now, the white media is saying that this bill has bipartisan support. Well, so did the Juneteenth bill, because both major parties recognize that this doesn't challenge white supremacy any more than a Juneteenth holiday did. This is what's going on here. Democrats and Republicans can't agree on what day of the week it is, and yet there's bipartisan support for these do-nothing gestures. But what I find to be particularly galling is that the white media makes sure to mention that there were the survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre who had actually testified before Congress. One of those individuals has since died, and these people are all over 100 years old. None of them demanded a national monument when they went before Congress. Did you hear them talking about that? Saying we want for our old neighborhood to be declared a national monument. They weren't talking about that. They went before Congress for one thing and one thing only: reparations. That's what they demanded. That's what they said the U.S. government has to do. Give them the reparations that they are due. Predictably, none of the white media pieces that talked about this mentioned that fact. Oh, they mentioned that the survivors had testified before Congress. But they did not mention the fact that those survivors demanded reparations. They didn't mention that at all. That was the entire reason that they were there. And the courts have illegally denied them justice. That wasn't mentioned either, by the way. If Democrats really wanted to do something regarding the Tulsa Race Massacre, then they should do what the survivors demanded, and that is to give the survivors and their family members reparations. That's what's called for here. But this is the Democrats' game. It's the Republicans as well. Both political parties on the exact same sheet of music when it comes to black people, and there's a lot of black folks silly enough to fall for it. That's why I make it a point to remind you of Biden's mountain of broken political promises. That's why we have to remain persistent. We can't allow ourselves to forget or to become apathetic. All these putrid attempts to give us do-nothing gestures should be rejected across the board. National holidays or national monuments are not reparations. Only money is reparations, and they're not offering that. About the only possible value that this gesture might have, at least in the abstract, is to put a thumb in the eye of the white right, at least some of them, and all of their demands to put back up Confederate monuments. But if that's the case, if the Democrats are really looking to basically give the Republican Party a black eye, then Democrats should have absolutely no problem going on a legislative rampage to block and reverse all of these red states who have passed laws to criminalize history and to criminalize black people just exercising their basic rights. All of this makes these states into free fire zones for blatant anti-black violence and blatant anti-black hostility. The Democrats should be on a jihad to go ahead and reverse that stuff, block those laws, and to do what they should have done decades ago, and that is to pass laws that punish all of this white supremacist culture, make the Confederate flag and any attempts to glorify it a civil offense. You don't see anywhere in Germany where you can put up the Nazi flag, and that's for a reason. When you've had an insurrection take place, when a rebellion has taken place, you don't sit there and glorify the iconography of the rebels. But of course, the United States is unique in this regard. That's because even those in the North accept the Confederate flag because they understand that it's a symbol of blatant, violent white supremacy, which they're fine with. The Tulsa Race Massacre was nothing more than part of a never-ending continuity of anti-black violence that continues to this day. without actually doing what black people have demanded, without actually putting tangible benefits on the table for those of us who have suffered racism in this country and continue to, without making sure that there's substantive measures in place to punish those who carry out anti-black violence, all of this message legislation is absolutely meaningless. It's nothing more than to misuse and abuse the tragedies that this country has enacted against black people for the sake of manipulating us into voting against our own interests. It is not in our interest to vote for nothing. It is not in our interest to have some white liberals on Capitol Hill and their black bootlicks telling us that we need to be voting for some politician who, by the way, actually praised the Confederacy. Joe Biden praised the Confederacy. He bragged about how during the Civil War, the state of Delaware that he represented was allied with the Confederacy. And of course, Joe Biden was mentored by those unreconstructed Confederates from down south. He was proud of that. And this is the guy that we're supposed to be expecting any sort of recognition of our basic humanity from? Don't dream. Rather than putting up yet another gesture of observation, instead there should be reparations and an anti-black hate crime law. But Cory Booker is not proposing any of that, and neither are any of the other do-nothing black members of Congress. It's not enough simply to say, well, we want to make it a national monument so people never forget. If you're not making sure that the victims of this race massacre and their descendants are compensated, because the entire reason that these massacres happened was because of economic jealousy by the poor white folks who live in those areas who could not stand to see black people who were making their way economically. It reminded them that white supremacy had failed to give them the goodies, giveaways, and guarantees of exclusive prosperity for themselves. That's the actual tangible benefits that white supremacy offers. But of course, because it's white supremacy, it has to give complete and thorough benefits for one group at the expense of black people. Slavery wasn't about national monuments. Slavery was about money. And these race massacres had nothing to do with some white woman claiming that she got raped. It had everything to do with the poor whites who were looking at their black neighbors' prosperity and understanding these black folks worked for what they had. And they were able to get their wealth out of the mud. They didn't have it handed to them because of white privilege. And they just couldn't stand it. If you want to make that area into a national monument, that's fine. But this gesture should be a launch pad for something substantive, reparations and an anti-black hate crime law, just for starters. Now, there's already an Asian hate crime law in the books, and all it took was a couple of college protests, and now there's all this hysteria about having an anti-Semitism bill, and when you look at that bit of proposed legislation, you see that all it is about is to protect Israel from being criticized. The United States is concerned about illegal aliens, the United States is concerned about Israel, but is not concerned about black Americans. And that's why we should not be concerned about this country or its leadership. See, there was also bipartisan support for that Asian hate crime law too. And naturally, there's going to be across-the-board bipartisan support for anything that Israel is demanding. They're bending over backwards, twisting themselves into knots to make sure that Benjamin Netanyahu's little fee-fees aren't hurt. But there's absolutely nothing being done to protect black people from being killed. Be on the watch out for the predictable parade of boot-licking Negroes, civil rights retreads, and HBU suck-ups who are going to go into fake orgasms about this proposed legislation, and they're going to claim that black people now have to vote for Biden. Why, he's the only thing standing between black people and another race massacre. Well, my answer to this canard is simply this. What did Biden do about the last one? Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Russell Richardson, Barrington Mack, Sa, Brandon Cherry, and Glenda Tice. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.